Oh,
Are you okay with being on camera?
I assume that's the plan.
Yeah, people need to see your beautiful face. If it's just me, that'd look weird, because then
Yeah.
there'd just be this disembodied voice.
My wife is saying if she knew, she would have given me a haircut this morning.
Okay. Hi, welcome to Can't Unread, the podcast about the texts and ideas that change us. Today I'm joined by my philosophy professor and advisor, Phil Shields, to talk about Robert Pippins' article, Participants and Spectators. I did some research, and it's from an online journal called On the Human, whose goal is to, quote, deepen understanding of the meaning and significance, if any, of being human, a pretty broad but respectable goal. Pippin's piece is about a facet of humanness that I think all of us can take for granted, which is our ability to act or to make changes in the world on our own terms. And I'm excited to talk about this article. Hey, Phil.
Hi, Rosie.
How are you?
I am fine. Looking forward to this.
Awesome sauce. All right, let's get started. Why did you pick this article?
Well, I thought the article raises a lot of issues I think are very contemporary, both in terms of the polarization and what might drive the polarization in our country in the last decade, the increasing polarization, but also something that has its roots in modernity as a whole. It's really about how should we make sense of what people do, their actions, as opposed to what merely happens to them, events.
To break down what you said slightly, when you're talking about modernity, about when do you think the modern period began? And are we talking mainly about Western development here?
Modernity, I'm really identifying with the rise of modern science. So Newton would be a big point where that took a kind of shift. There was a story leading up to that, but I think at that point it really became a dominant worldview. And I think in philosophy, around Descartes, you have some similar sorts of issues going, and I think Kant also expresses the Newtonian view in a way and is trying to grapple with where do we put agency in that world and compared to that world. And sorry, we're going off a little bit, but I want to clarify some of what you're saying. What aspect specifically of modern thought did the philosophers you just mentioned grapple with? Descartes, for example, adopts a view that is really a spectator view in his method.
So that means to objectively see the world from a sort of...
To see it from a more detached outside view, where you're not implicated in it. And you have a kind of dispassionate view. So Descartes boasts about being without care, without feeling, without any responsibilities, snowed in the middle of winter. And that's when he can be objective and he can think clearly.
Right.
So this is part of a kind of prejudice that really has some old roots going back to ancient Greece, where Anaxagoras said, what makes mind distinctive is it's unmixed. That is, it's outside of reality somewhere. And that mind being unmixed allows it to both know the world, and it's from this outside view, and act on the world from an outside perspective. And so both our notion of agency and our notion of knowledge come from that kind of privileging of this outside view. So do you think, and that leads to a notion of agency as manipulation, where you manipulate people as objects for your own purposes.
Right. Because
you're thinking of them as things and you're outside of them. And so there's a certain notion of reasoning that implicates. There's a certain notion of reality as passive things that can be acted on from the outside. And it ends up bifurcating a notion of agency from the world, where the world is just a series of events, and it's hard to find out where human agency fits in that world.
I think it's probably pretty difficult for us, trademark symbol, now to imagine a worldview that's different than that. You know, as a person who believes in the principles of science and of the Enlightenment period, I have faith in our ability to, at least to some degree, detach ourselves in an objective way from a situation and to observe it. And I know that in the criticisms you're going to make here, you're not always going to say that that's completely wrong, but it's something that we need to look at a little more carefully. Do you think you could talk about what an alternative view is, perhaps one that was held before that? Because I think that's hard for a lot of us to imagine.
The examples in my own teaching are both Taoism and Chinese thought in the ancient classical context, where there isn't any outside view. You're in nature, you're a part of nature, and there isn't the notion of a transcendent God or an observer outside. The other one would be Aristotle and the kind of Greek notion of teleology saturating the world, where everything acts for the sake of ends. And so the world is a meaningful place where there's purpose. They're not just blind events. And modern science is really built on the rejection of that principle. And so the genius of Newton was to give an account of the world in purely causal terms. And the genius of Darwin is to extend that to living things, which looked purposive and functional.
Right.
It looks like we develop a thumb in order to grasp a tool, but he shows that's an illusion, that really through natural selection processes and the survival of the fittest, there isn't any designer, there isn't any purpose, that those are just human prejudices that we project onto that.
When people talk about evolution, I kind of see that issue that you just mentioned. I feel like even though we understand that evolution is just a process, it feels intentional. I have a favorite semi-useless animal feature. I wanted to share this. On cats, there is a part of the ear called Henry's pocket. If you look at your cat's ear, it's like kind of like right here. Some people think that it helps them hear better because of the way that it traps the air, but essentially people don't know why it's there. And I find that quite charming. This piece is centered on the idea of agency. He asks, what, if anything, differentiates an action from a mere event? I think it's important to get clear on the distinction here between an action and an event. Do you think you can talk about that?
Okay. Yes. I think, suppose you see someone falling and you assume it's an event that someone pushed them. And your friend says, no, he's an Italian soccer player. He's taking a dive. And what that introduces into it is that there's purpose and intention. It's not just an outcome of causality, but it's a purposive doing. In this case, made to look like it's just a random effect, while it's really a purposive, intentional act.
I like imagining the dive just happening spontaneously for fun.
So, well, it matters that you're an Italian soccer player.
Exactly.
So,
I'll just say that next time I do something awkward. Yeah, go on.
So when we think of asking why, an event, the answer to a why question, is a cause. There are no purposes insofar as it's just an event. And that's what science does, is it tries to give a purely causal descriptive account of how changes happen without reference to intention or purpose or the good of it, And so it strips values and facts and just leaves you with the facts. So from an outside view, from the spectator view that Pippin talks about, you don't have value. You just have facts, facts, and more facts, but no value. Mm-hmm. And you can think of this as if you were to look at a chessboard and you weren't familiar with the game, so you're looking at it from the outside, you just see a bunch of pieces of wood.
That's true.
And there's no such thing as good and bad moves from the outside. Mm-hmm. There's just pieces of wood that might move around or do things, and you can describe them and you could give a kind of description of the facts, but you wouldn't be able to invoke value judgments about it being a good or bad move from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Something I was just sort of reminded of when you said that is sometimes when I watch people talking in a language that I'm not familiar with, I start to see the interaction not exactly as something deliberately meaningful, but like, look, this is humans very loosely doing some kind of human thing. And I'm sometimes sort of just struck by that, because then obviously it's not just other people. I turn on to myself. I look at the activities of my daily life, and, I can think about the fact that I feel intentional in them. But from this bird's eye view, I'm just looking at this weird organism trying to do things right, maybe having things influence it. I look at the causal nature of it.
So I had that same experience when I was in architecture school and we were doing making parks. And part of designing parks is to see how they're used over a day. And so they do a time-lapsed camera of where people go in the park, how they behave, where they sit. And it's like one frame every minute or something. And so you get the whole day collapsed into 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And you just see bodies kind of moving in different kind of ways.
Yeah.
And that gives you this kind of detached sense of human behavior without thinking about, oh, I got to go home to get lunch, or this person needs to go to the bathroom, or this person is this or that. What you see are these kind of macro behaviors.
Like particles.
And this is just what Descartes describes when he first introduces the notion that we're just machines. Mm-hmm. And he does it by looking down in Paris from the top of Notre Dame Cathedral, and he's way up on top, and he just sees hats moving around. And he says,
that's
for
a
all
lot of
we
hats.
know, that's a lot. Well, there's just the hats in front of the courtyard in front of Notre Dame. And he says they could just be machines.
Yeah.
What does he know about, the person, the intention, the meaning there?
I think something, interesting and disturbing about that is that I think, while we both had these sort of semi-singular experiences, I think we do this to people all the time. I think that since we're only actively aware of what we feel are our own intentions and desires, when we watch other people, I think it's really easy to dehumanize them, to kind of create an us and them.
So I think that's exactly the concern that partly prompted me to pick this article.
Really?
Is what's at stake in understanding the shift from a spectator view to a participant view. And I think the political situation in the country has amplified the differences and led to polarization, where groups of people aren't looking at other groups as people, but as political forces that of one kind or another. They get objectified, they get thought of as just promoting power interests, and they're not really engaged or listened to in terms of the meaning of what they say and why they're saying it.
And do you think this happens on both sides of the political spectrum?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
What does Pippin mean when he describes agency as a social status, which is sort of the solution he wants to give here?
I initially wasn't sure when I read that, and then it became clear when I read this a second time. We have a long history in philosophy of trying to protect agency by giving the mind some kind of metaphysical status.
Right.
So Descartes' solution is to say there's a special substance called mental substance, and that's where thought is. And Pippin doesn't want to go there. So he doesn't want to invoke a kind of metaphysical self, like Kant does as well, a noumenal self that's outside the realm of phenomena, because then it creates more problems than it solves. It allows it to exist, but doesn't allow it to interact. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't want to be a dualist. And so he also doesn't want to invoke metaphysics. So to make it a social status is to make it a free-floating normative phenomena. So if you think about what we do with children, we make them a part of our family and of the human community. We give them a name, mm-hmm. and we start bestowing responsibilities to them and a status. We make a place for them. And insofar as they come to internalize that identity and understand their place, they can act from that place. It gives them a place to stand, and it gives them, and so in that sense, selves aren't in some kind of metaphysical given.
Right.
They're things that emerge socially through language and enculturation and socialization. We ascribe, just as you become a professor by having a certain kind of training, mm-hmm. and being recognized as a professor. And I remember the first class I ever taught was a continuing education class in Chicago, where everyone in the class was twice my age. And I was a grad student, and I was terrified because it was set up to be professionals who had advanced degrees and wanted to go back and do some humanities. And I thought, how can I teach them? They're all my elders, and they have so much more experience and so forth. But I was the professor.
Yeah.
And you go in, and they bestow the status on you. They make a space for you to be the authority on that topic, even if they held back on other issues. On philosophy, they were deferring to my expertise and interested in looking at what I had to say in a way that made that possible. Mm-hmm. So agency as a whole is a way of treating each other as people and not things. And that requires invoking a realm of normativity and meaning, where to be a person is a kind of status that we have.
Normativity is one of your favorite words. Why don't we get a slightly clear on it?
A norm, in short, is a fact that has value, and a value based in a fact. And so it emerges by imitation, a child imitating language use, and at first not doing it with meaning. They just do what their parents say. Just like we would in a French class, we repeat what the French teacher says. We don't understand it, and we don't say it with meaning. But you have to do it before you can do it with meaning. And so you habituate yourself, you develop the capacity bodily and vocally to make the sounds, to do it. And at some point, it becomes normative. You can do it as the French teacher did it. So at first you did it just in imitation of the French teacher, but at some point you no longer need the French teacher. It's now become internalized. You have the grammar within you, and at some point you're capable of doing it without the teacher or the exemplar, and that's where you're doing it based on the meaning and not simply by repetition.
Mm-hmm. When you teach, you like to emphasize the fact that norms are very important for human functioning in general. And I was wondering if you could give a couple concrete examples of norms, without which things would kind of fall apart. We wouldn't be able to communicate with each other.
Oh, well, I don't know where to begin with that. All of language.
All of language.
And I think if I pick a very primitive example, if we think of a bicycle and we want to, put an object on the seat so that it balances, we'd have to have an extremely subtle and nuanced account of the causes, the forces, and the weights to get something to just balance on the seat and the bike balancing on the two wheels, it wouldn't last long. It would fall.
Right.
If I were limited to prediction, I would have to have an extremely nuanced account. And if I were going to predict that the person not only was going to get on and balance the bicycle, but ride it to Des Moines, I would have to understand so much about the muscles and all the physical causes going into that system that it just becomes astronomically complex and impossible. We don't have that kind of grasp and understanding. I don't have to understand the initial conditions to this astronomically complex degree to be able to causally predict that I am going to ride to Des Moines. When we intend to do something, it's a different kind of know-how than when we predict it. We don't merely predict of ourselves that we're going to Des Moines. Rather, we make a commitment. We make an intention. So we aim at a goal. Well, that allows us to, when we start falling this way, make a correction. When we start falling that way, make a correction. I'm going to end up in Des Moines, and I'm going to stay on top of the bicycle, and the bicycle is going to stay balanced. But those are things that are only possible because I'm part of the system. I am inside it. I'm a participant in the bicycle. If I were limited to being a spectator or an observer, I wouldn't be able to get it to Des Moines, right?
My favorite norm, the wave. Have you ever done the wave film?
Oh, yes.
Yes, very good example of normativity. So these ideas about agency and about normativity tie into some of your views on identity theory. The political theory, not to be confused with the theory of mind, identity theory, which is that your the brain and the mind are the same thing. But anyway, I think identity theory, which some people call identity politics, it's kind of a hot term. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot. And I was wondering if you could pin down a bit what it means. Okay.
First, I want to say some things I agree with identity theory and the kind of assumptions that often go into it.
All right.
I think there's a lot of forms of identity theory. Some of them coming from Marxist traditions, some of it coming from post-structuralism and from a lot of different. But what many of them have in common is a critique of classical liberalism and the kind of classical liberal individualism.
Right.
The notion that we are just pre-constituted individuals. It's a kind of metaphysical status we have. And that entering into society or having relationships or forming a government is a kind of extrinsic contract that these individuals enter into. But that requires according them a kind of metaphysical personhood instead of the social status that Pippin wanted to talk about.
Right.
That we're just metaphysically people, and then we enter into society. This requires often an idea that Descartes invoked of having the natural light of reason. We can get rid of all of our social history, Descartes thought. We could set aside all the prejudices from our past, from our religion, from our upbringing, from our language, and start over as rational beings who just think.
That sounds nice. I mean, it sounds bad and also sounds nice.
So there's, methodological problems with that, because what language are you thinking with, and how can you build anything back up if you don't have any assumptions? I mean, it just becomes a kind of a non-starter.
Right.
But that was kind of the dream of modernism, was to escape the past, because the past is full of prejudice, the past is full of superstition, and the dream was that science would somehow give us a objective, fact-based view that didn't involve superstition and ultimately didn't involve value. But if you don't have values, you also don't have any reason to act. So
Right.
It becomes really problematic for an ethical theory. But it was the hope. The view was that the past was so tainted with superstition, with error, that we need to just set aside or destroy it and start over. And that's what I think the driving impulse of modernity was, to reject traditionalism and put things back on a rational footing, on a rational foundation. And science was really the paradigm of what that would be. Science and mathematics. I think many of us agree, as I was saying, that the classical liberal assumptions of the self and of the person as being a kind of pre-constituted thing that's prior to social relations.
There's just this sort of default citizen.
Well, a default thinker who kind of knows who they are and what they are, and then they try to have reasons for entering into relationships, and then you invoke Hobbes and the social contract and Locke and all this stuff. So you get a kind of view of the self as giving up some of their freedom in order to be protected from the violence of others and the coercion of others. And so social relations are kind of a second best. They're a way to just kind of protect yourself and your autonomy and your freedom. It puts a tremendous weight on autonomy and freedom as getting away from governmental constraints as much as possible and give people as much space within that to be free.
Right.
Now, the alternative, which both the traditions leading into identity theory and pragmatists and Hegelians and Marxists would all emphasize, is that it's only in society that we become people. It's through social relations. And this really harkens back to Aristotle, that we are social animals, not as Descartes and Kant thought, a thinking thing in a mind somewhere. But we are first and foremost embodied. And so understanding that we're embodied means we are in a place and a time. We are tied to relationships with others. We all had parents. We all have various kinds of relationships. Aristotle remarked that if you see a solitary person, they're either a beast or a god. His point is to be human is to be something between a beast and a god.
Right.
And that involves social relationships. And I think that's largely right. That, the early modern period really got off the track with some of its dualisms. It was over-impressed, perhaps, by the success of physics, and lost sight of really what it meant to be a human being in terms of our social nature.
Now, I think that's all very true, but critical theory or identity theory, critical theory being rooted in Marxism, identity theory being the more general term, is specifically rooted in the idea of what you might call power dynamics or power structures. It's focused on critically thinking about sort of who makes the rules in a society and who constrains whom. So as you were saying, it sort of doesn't speak in terms of individuals, but in terms of norms and practices established over time that historically influence your identity and your abilities, kind of whether you like it or not. But it's also historically has been a very important tool in recognizing the disadvantages that certain groups have, that perhaps many, including often in my opinion, sort of merit correction. So when we use words like patriarchy or colonialism or sometimes capitalism, we're invoking critical theory. We're invoking these, as many people say, power structures that create imbalances that go beyond what individuals have done. It's about institutional practices and standards that perhaps are implicit in individual behavior, like when we talk about microaggressions and stuff, that harm individuals, sometimes without the people responsible knowing it, because they have that sort of historical frame. So I think that's critical theory is more specifically about power, and I think you agree with this.
Okay. Yes. I think going back to kind of working into this in terms of what I would agree with the critical theory and with the identity politics is we're all assuming that there isn't a neutral perspective on things. There isn't a neutral place where people can talk. There are always asymmetries in knowledge and in power and in all kinds of positionality. There also is no way to think, and this is part of the critique of the individualism, without being embedded in social relations, in language, in disciplines, methodologies, etc. Right? So that's the notion that we can only think and act using the values and the norms we have. And we're all left in that position. And where people are will be stratified by class, by race, and by various other institutional and historical, social statuses of one kind or another. There's no God's eye view. We are in the mix. So that's a way in which the spectator view is being rejected on a certain level. Okay, that means you're left with a kind of a historicism. If the world is partly a function of our social approach and our interpretive framework and our language and our traditions, the world will change over time. It'll be a different world in really substantial, fundamental ways. This is Hegel, who really develops this historicism. And I think the Marxists obviously are coming to that tradition. I think the identity theorists as well. And I'd agree with that. Lastly, we're left with this notion that our relationships become essential to who we are. And so we aren't just all people. We are people of a certain kind, shape, and nature, given our relations to our parents, our communities, our religious traditions, our ethnicities, our practices, there's just all this history that goes into shaping who we are. And that those things matter. They're part of who we are. So just as there's no neutral view of reality, there's no neutral generic self. And since we are embedded in different places in historical social phenomena, we will have different identities and different positionalities where those differences are substantial and relevant to who we are.
Right.
They're not all just inessential. Okay. And I think I am on board with that understanding coming out of critical theory or used in identity theory as well.
So what is it that you disagree with then?
I think there is a use of those methods and approaches that bear some complicity in our current polarized world. So I think there is a tendency to reinvoke the spectator view in a way that objectifies groups of people and quits addressing them as agents and starts just addressing them as power structures.
Do you think you can give an example?
So I can give an example. I guess what I'm thinking about is what sense of objectification. And it's to see someone, to speak as a identity, to say speaking as a white man or speaking as a cisgendered white man is to invoke a series of positions, each of which, if it's to have meaning, are invoking some sort of stereotypical nature.
So it's sort of judging who's saying the thing as opposed to what's being said.
Yes, it's inherently, I think, ad hominem.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of listening to the content of what people say, you're judging it in part by who's saying it.
Do you think it's not possible to balance recognizing, I know you don't like power structures because it makes them seem less fluid than they are.
I need to say more about that. So
sure.
Yeah, but I think where you're going, I do think there's some balance, and I think there's, of course, things to be learned. And I think the question is whether it's been overused in a way that has accentuated the polarization of our country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the position. Is I think there's legitimate insights, and there were some needs to bring things to people's attention, and there are ongoing needs, but it also needs to be balanced with a way to reach people that's persuasive, and persuading people requires listening and addressing them as agents and listening to what they say and not just dismissing them for who they are. And I think that's where we are now, where everyone dismisses everyone, and so everyone just reads things they agree with. I think where some of this comes from, or a way to understand it, I think, comes back to how Foucault has been used. And Foucault is a source for a lot of the identity theorists. Not all. Marx was another big source. But Foucault really focuses on the notion of normativity. And he has a frequently cited metaphor called the panopticon.
Right, yeah.
About how normativity can be understood. And in the panopticon, you have a kind of prison. It was designed by Jeremy Bentham as a reform that's circular with each cell facing a central tower. So it takes only one guard to see into all the cells that are around the circle.
This has always haunted me.
It's a picture that's haunting because we were already familiar to the idea of God watching us, omnipresent, and we're all guilty in the eyes of God. So there's an old religious kind of version of that. But this was made into a prison. And in the prison, the prisoners can't tell whether the guard is watching them. And so they internalize the fear that the guard might be watching, and they have to act as if the guard is watching, even if the guard wasn't watching. In fact, even if there was no guard in the guard tower. And so it ends up disciplining your behavior, not by external power, but by normative power. You internalize the expectation of being watched, and then you judge yourself, and you hold yourself up to these norms in ways that you've built a prison in your own mind. You've built a prison that the jail has become inside of you and not just physically out there. Now, I think that's a powerful image.
Ouch.
And I think Foucault actually uses it in his later work in more subtle, complex ways. I think he is interested in agency and starts trying to introduce it. But this image is the popular one, the panopticon, that gets used to understand what normativity is.
Right.
And where I would locate my concern is really boils down to the metaphors we use. And by thinking of the internalization as an inward prison, you're understanding norms in merely a restrictive negative sense, instead of also as enabling our own agency and our own meaningful actions. So if you replace the panopticon with something that I think is functionally equivalent, which is enculturation of a child in a family by parents. And this is Aristotle. So what are you doing when you socialize a child? You're giving them behaviors that initially are external, and they get habituated till they internalize them and start to speak in ways that they impose on themselves. But that's just the point we talked about earlier, where they start to use it meaningfully. And they now can act as agents who can use words with meaning and not merely blindly repeating this external discipline. And that notion of it being enabling is the crucial difference between being an agent and just being a determined, self-disciplined blob of body, right? To just have a disciplined body. And that's the language that gets used. It's disciplining your body. And that's the behavior, the internalization of the norm does that. But it also makes you an agent, capable of something. And so disciplining your body isn't merely a prison. It's also a kind of creative act that makes you capable of acting in a way that isn't just a prison, that isn't just reproducing the past. And if we're not going to be determined, we can't use that prison metaphor. because that throws us right back into the old problem of understanding the determination in a purely mechanical, all-consuming way.
Phil, I agree with you 100% theoretically, but I sort of wonder if, proponents of identity theory, I am definitely one of them in some ways, who just have an idea of how it applies, politically speaking, often don't think that far, but kind of in a good way, that it can be a useful tool to simply recognize certain injustices. I see why you might attribute polarization to it, but I wonder if there are other external factors, issues with the media and with our current president that are, perhaps rooted in an extreme form of some of those issues, but that are also just weird general phenomena happening in the world right now, especially in our country, that we can't really conflate with identity theory as a whole. Sometimes when I see people, invoking identity theory, it makes a lot of sense because I think it's true that there are power dynamic structures, whatever, that have historically oppressed certain people, and I think those need to be fixed. And I worry about criticizing it if we're kind of going in the wrong direction there. If maybe we're conflating some of the causes of polarization right now.
I think I'd agree that Trump has raised this polarization and objectification to new extremes. Mm-hmm. But I think it had been going on for 20 years, and you can trace it, or even 30. So it has an older roots. And the reason Trump could become elected is the country was already polarized. He wouldn't have been elected if we were healthy. Mm-hmm. But the polarizations were already there, and he exploited that and accentuated it. And a lot of other things have as well. I think the technology, social media, a lot of these things help create this polarization. But I think the thing that I would see as contributing is in understanding how internalization of norms and normativity becomes a prison instead of an agent, is very subtle. It's not much different. It's constraint, but it's what kind of constraint and whether constraints enable or not, and which constraints. And so I think part of what blinds us there are the metaphors we use. And to speak of social construction at all is
right. You talked a lot about that term.
Is to objectify. Well, I used it myself. I mean, that's how I teach normativity. It's a social construction of reality. But the notion of production is an industrial metaphor. The notion of construction is an architectural metaphor. All of these are reifying metaphors that reify and make into things that are mechanical and function causally in deterministic ways, when what we really need to be talking about are human practices. And a practice may generally incline us to do something. It's normative, but it doesn't have to be determining, and we don't have to be objectified to be part of the practice. So instead of a normative structure, speak of a normative practice where you acknowledge ongoing human complicity in having a role, both for good and for ill. And hence they can be accountable for the excesses of those norms and the ones that are unhealthy and unjust. And if we adopt the Foucaultian, I think the identity
theorists might say the same thing, though. But yes, I see what you're saying.
I think it gets lost, and it gets lost because of the Foucaultian move. And I think the other place one would understand this is in terms of privilege. Privilege comes in many forms. And in the current parlance, privilege becomes purely negative. Privilege
I do think that's true, yes.
White privilege, male privilege, and so forth, certain class privileges. But I think we should remember that there's also the privilege of a parent. There's the privilege of a doctor, a privilege of a lawyer or a teacher. And those involve asymmetrical powers that we think are legitimate, at least in the usual case, and enabling. Children need to have parents who have certain privileges to determine what language they speak, where they live, what kind of practices they have. And the process of being a historical, ongoing community that can be accountable and have agency requires that there be certain kind of a distinction between someone having a privilege that's legitimate and using it within the realms that are appropriate to that, and being abusive and having illegitimate. So we know there's an abusive parent, but that doesn't mean all parents are abusive. There are abusive teachers. It doesn't mean all teachers are abusive. So there has to be a way of understanding power, normative power, that isn't necessarily abusive just because it's unequal.
I don't think that a smart identity theorist would claim that, by virtue of being white and having white privilege, you're bad. I think they would say that there's something to be looked at and dismantled and challenged there, because you having that sort of power is essentially historically arbitrary. But I guess I'd like to believe.
No, I agree with that.
Right.
So I just want us to distinguish between the kinds of power that's arbitrary and inappropriate, and the kinds of power that aren't.
I agree with that.
And even what counts as appropriate is historical. At one time, class privilege was legitimate, and we no longer believe that. The French Revolution largely put that to sleep. So we had a time where all the classes agreed that if you are a certain class, that entailed certain responsibilities and certain privileges that were constitutive of your identity in that class. And so gradually, we came to challenge that for a lot of very interesting historical reasons, partly coming from Christianity and being equal before God and the kind of certain religious traditions. But it developed a kind of egalitarianism on the religious level that became valued on the political level. And we should each have one vote, and we should each have equal rights before the law and so forth.
I'm afraid there's a sort of risk of relativism there. I'm not sure if, based on what you said, I could be able to, in good moral standing, say that I thought that kind of class distinction was right back then, and now it's wrong because of different social circumstances. Okay. What do you think? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, I think relativism is important to recognize to a degree, and that's part of what identity theory is doing. So part of the historicism is that what is real is historical, and that's true morally as well, that what counts as appropriate, justified behavior is different at different times historically. Now, what I agree with is that doesn't mean that we can't give an account retrospectively of why we're distancing ourselves from the way they understood morality and how we're understanding it now. So we do have a responsibility to not simply say they had a different understanding, but we're ultimately accountable for justifying, or at least giving reasons for why we think what we're doing now is better than what they did then.
Right. I think that's interesting because actually one of my main issues that I have with identity politics is that sometimes it does fall into that sort of relativism when it starts to question the fundamental meaning-making practices by putting subjective experience before the discourse. I don't know if that made some sense. When someone says, and once again, can sometimes be legitimate, but you can't argue against that because you'll just never understand what I've been through. Yeah. And I want to be careful criticizing something like that because I think it has power and I think it can be accurate, but I also think sometimes it just stops the conversation.
Yeah. No, I think I agree with that, but I also share your concern that often that comes from a place of pain and hurt. And if we were in a relationship with a friend or a spouse, And they would say, well, you won't understand that. We would give them some respect and distance and say, okay, I'll wait, and I'll keep listening, and we wouldn't expect. We would trust them on that. I think that becomes harder when this gets said not in a already established personal relationship, but in a political context where we've already objectified one another. Now, I think there are times in our personal relationships where we need breaks and we do need to stop conversations. But I agree with you that in the big picture, politically, we can't stop the conversation. We need to keep trying to persuade. And you can't persuade someone if you're not explaining your reasons.
Right.
And so to say, because of a kind of inequality of power and privilege, you can't expect someone who is marginalized to justify what they feel and experience, I think is understandable, but ultimately self-defeating. It's precisely those who are marginalized who most need to invoke reasons and moral justifications. As Gandhi said, are we supposed to fight the British soldiers with sticks? Of course you make moral arguments. That's not, and to expect them to is to say it's not all about power. It's about making reasons that have moral weight to persuade people of your position. And it's true that it's difficult if you feel marginalized to speak. But I think the asymmetries there can only be addressed by speaking.
Yeah.
And to not speak ends up abdicating any process for overcoming it and leaving it just on the level of coercion. And if you're marginalized, you're going to lose that war. Trump's got the mic.
Right.
And he's got the bully pulpit. And if you simply say, I don't have to respond, I don't have to challenge it, ends up letting power win. If you're going to speak truth to power, or you're going to challenge injustices, you have to legitimate the reasoning and the citing of moral reasons from positions where you're not in power, because that's the source of gaining power, that kind of understanding and reasoning.
I think it's really difficult. I think you're mostly right. I also think everyone has sort of a line of what reasonably needs to be explained and what doesn't. If you're like, I don't know, let's kill everyone with purple hair or something, and then you kind of lay out your pseudo-logical argument that appears to sort of hold together, and you're like, here, this is why we should kill all people with purple hair. To most people, that should sound so ridiculous that they feel no need to respond to that. And I think that one of the issues that we have is that people's lines of, what's simply wrong are like kind of very sharply defined right now. And in my biased opinion, I think that viewpoints on the left are profoundly right, and those on the right tend to be often very wrong. And a certain subset of those views, I really consider whether or not it's worth it to hear the argument. I think, one of the aspects that I didn't really mention in my example is the problem of, even though I don't really like this term, I think emotional labor is a thing.
Yeah.
And, if you feel forced to rehear these same arguments over and over, maybe at and they hurt you to hear them, maybe at some point it's not your responsibility to respond anymore. I think there's a specific cultural term for this, sea lioning. I don't know why it refers to a sea lion. Maybe someone can fill me in on that. But it has to do with trying to continue this harmful conversation under the guise of, but I just want you to see my side and understand what I'm saying. Yeah. And I think it's difficult. I think it's really hard.
This gets back to my acknowledgement that there's always times where we need breaks. There's times where in relationships we have that we can't always be expected to explain. Sometimes it's let's talk later. Sometimes it's I can't talk about this now, and that's a fair move as a holding, as a kind of, but it can't be generalized. Like, I never have to talk to you again. Things
Right.
that make that not just a temporary pause, but some kind of permanent refusal to talk. That
Is
the
there-
process seems to stop then.
Is there no circumstance under which you can imagine that being legitimate?
No,
what I think
there
about,
is, but I mean, I think you
Right.
might choose to talk to slightly different people.
Right.
There are plenty of people on the political spectrum I don't talk to. I'm on the left as well.
When you say that, I'm imagining people saying the same thing to you.
Yeah.
Them feeling the same way toward you, and I think that's the thing, man.
Yeah.
Before, when you were speaking about this, I kind of got this idea, but now I realize this isn't quite what you think. That you have this strong faith that people can be convinced by a good argument. I think people are stupid. I think I'm stupid.
Yeah.
I think we're all pretty stupid. Sometimes I wonder
No,
if
but
that's really true. And I think
it's part of just the scientific method.
Yeah.
You have to keep trying. It's all we've got, and it, much of the time people are locked in to their theories. But if the theories aren't tested, then agency's off the table. That's the only thing that keeps us afloat. Mm-hmm. And to play on that metaphor, I've mentioned I don't like the construction metaphors that come out of modernity. The Greeks tend to use more organic metaphors. And the one I like for this comes out of Plato's Phaedo, where he said our knowledge and our arguments, what we're doing in this dialogue and arguing with one another, are like logs in a raft. It's a humble craft, but it's all we've got that keeps us afloat.
I
And
really like that. Sorry, go ahead.
it's only justified if we keep using it and repairing it. And so however humble it is, it's tentative, it's where we're thrown. We just find ourselves, we grab things ready to hand, we use the norms our parents and our society gives us. But we're not limited to that. We're standing on the raft. It's our positionality and our identity. We're entitled to use those norms as best we can until we can see reasons to doubt them. So we start trusting the world our parents bestowed on us, and we gradually, when children rather quickly, challenge aspects of it, right? So you cut off this log, but you're standing on the other ones. And so you depend on it as well as you're limited by it. You can only go where this raft takes you. And it's a humble craft. It doesn't move very fast, but it's all that keeps you afloat.
I really like that metaphor/analogy, but I want to push back again and say I think that people do see that we have something else, and we have violence. And sometimes violence gets the job done when discourse doesn't. And I definitely think
Gets which job done is the question. So if all you're looking for is a power result, you can get a power result, but at a cost. And so the question is
but maybe
whether
the cost
you get,
is better than the alternative.
Maybe, but
Yeah.
if you think what you need is to convince hearts and minds, then the violence actually polarizes. It doesn't persuade.
I just think you think people are too good.
Well, I think we have to think people are good, or we can't do it from the inside. So if we don't think people are good, then only a God can save us. And I don't want to have to rely on a transcendent God to save us.
Me
I want
neither.
us to be able to save ourselves, which means I'm going to work with assumptions that allow that to be possible. You got to assume people are by and large good and by and large reasonable, or it's off the table.
I think there are other options other than discourse or violence. I think this is why we have some of the political systems that we do. I think, we can institute policy changes in a non-violent way sometimes.
So
that-
democracy is between that.
Right.
So you vote, and the majority coerces the minority after a discussion. So you have room for debate, you have room for conversation, but in the end you vote, right? But that's not unlike what happens with children and parents, or with teachers and students. You know, you have room for conversation, normative argument, people reasoning and giving explanations and trying to justify what they're saying. But you know, in the end, the professor assigns the grade.
Right.
But at some point, students get better and better until they can do it without the professor and don't need the professor anymore, and can think and be critical and whatever, and may realize the professor was wrong.
See,
and have good reasons for thinking that.
Yeah,
right?
This is so interesting to me because I know that you don't describe yourself as a conservative, but speaking of metaphors, it feels like the language that you use. But especially George Lakoff has studied different types of metaphor use when he talks about conservatives and liberals. And of course, he's the original Metaphors We Live By guy, but that's neither here nor there. And he talks about how...
I need to read that.
Whoa.
I need to read that book.
Yeah, it's good. He talks about how conservatives in general tend to use this sort of family language to describe the relationship between a people and the state. And the other thing that makes me think that you're more conservative, or at least based on what I've read, is that conservatives tend to have this idea that society, the norms are, social norms are so important that we have to be very careful in changing them. I think one of the quotes I read, I don't remember who said this, but that it's like tending to your father's wounds or something like that. It's about how, to an extent, no matter how shitty things appear, we have this ground that we really have to be careful in altering. And that's something that I sort of hear reflected in what you say.
Well, I think I see where you're coming from with that.
Yeah.
And I think all I would add is the things you said are half true. There's also the historicism.
Right.
There's also the relativism, that you won't understand it until the change happens. And so you need both processes, both ideas, that change can be for the worst. Just because you're changing things doesn't mean you're changing it for the better. There needs to be some kind of process or account of the change. And this is kind of invoking the original sin tradition, where things are so bad you can't improve yourself. But if you think things are evil, then you can't get to where you need to go without something outside the system, without a God to tell you the blueprint of how to save yourself, or Marx to tell you, how to liberate yourself. And so that kind of outside voice is the spectator that I'm nervous about. That if we need a theorist to tell us that, our own conscious reasons are really just an illusion, and that we're just serving patriarchy, or we're just serving bourgeois capitalism, or whatever, we have robbed ourselves of the capacity to participate as agents in the process.
Right.
And I think that's a price too high to pay.
I see the point you're making, and I think that, on one hand, when someone rightfully perhaps points out an advantage that you have that shaped who you are, you may say, wait, but I did that. That was me. And, that can be an incorrect assumption. And, I can feel that intuitive, in a sense that I think that it's wrong, right? It's just how I react. I see it as a sort of personal slight because we like to believe that we're responsible for our lives. But at the same time, I think you can go too far with it and take away a person's agency, as you've described, by completely attributing things to your privilege or to, one of the buzzwords that you used. And I think about that a lot because I have that feeling in response to both of those things. It's hard to recognize where the line is there.
I think this kind of brings us back to something you'd mentioned before, that some kind of balance is needed.
We should probably wrap up. I actually have a lot more things that I still want to talk about. Maybe one last question. Essentially, I want to ask this question, but it's difficult. But what do you think needs to change to correct some of the issues that you see sort of what once again, I'm not saying I fully agree with you, but if I were to want to institute the Phil view and believe that identity politics were primarily responsible for some of these issues, what should people be doing differently in their lives to avoid some of those issues?
Well, I think we've already talked about them. I mean,
right,
I think the big issue is, I think the polarization hurts everybody. And I don't think there's an easy fix. It's kind of self-perpetuating. And so I just hope to contribute a little bit of patience, and kind of an understanding that polarization undermines the process for all concerned, because it is a battle for hearts and minds. It's a battle for being able to persuade people in ways that respect them as persons. Mm-hmm. And when we polarize, we objectify, and we don't treat people respectfully as persons.
Yeah.
And how to make that possible, I think, is really hard. But I think it's quite clear that things have gotten a lot worse in very quick time and quick order. And I think technologies play into this. And, I don't know how to fix the technological side. There might be things that Facebook and Twitter and others can do.
Yeah, that's a whole nother thing.
If they were mindful of their responsibility and of how this polarizes people into camps where they distrust and amplify and demonize others in a way that makes people less inclined to actually listen to what they say. Because if anything can save us, it's not power, it's the meaning of what people say. Mm-hmm. And that is a kind of power, that kind of normative power. But to think of it just as power doesn't allow agency to play a role. Because if it's back to power, then I don't think there is a place for agency. Agency only has a place insofar as we are guided by the meaning of what we're saying and not just by the privileges and the power behind it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you, Phil. I thought that was a really wonderful conversation.
Yes, I always enjoy talking with you, Rosie. Thank you.
Awesome. So that was Phil Shields and I talking about Robert Pippins' Participants and Spectators, and that article's relationship to agency and identity theory. Thanks for watching / listening. You can find this article on can'tunread.com, as well as the other episodes and their respective articles and the show notes. So thank you so much. Hopefully see you next week or at some point.